Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in adjournment proceedings tonight to take up a question that I asked earlier this spring. It might be considered to have been somewhat stale dated by this point, but there are current issues of real importance related to the question that I asked of the Prime Minister back in the month of March. It was on the eve of the very important meeting of the Arctic Council that took place in Fairbanks, Alaska. It was the last meeting where the United States chaired the Arctic Council for a brief period when the Obama administration represented the United States in international affairs. It was very clear that we were making progress in, ironically, repairing the damage that Canada had done as chair under the previous Conservative government. Under Canada's chairmanship of or chairpersonship of the Arctic Council, climate change was ignored and shelved as an issue. And when chairmanship went from Canada to the U.S. under Obama, we began to see the focus that one would expect in a time of galloping climate change in the Arctic. It's critical to look at the impacts on not just the Arctic as a specific region, but the impacts for the planet of a warming Arctic. In any case, the question I put to the Prime Minister was, would Canada stand firmly with Nordic nations to ensure that the urgency of climate change and the commitment to the Paris Accord was reflected in the communique from the Arctic Council? And I have to say I'm very, very pleased. Canada did step up. The Trump administration was somewhat sidelined. In the end, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson signed on to the joint declaration from the Arctic Council in Fairbanks, Alaska in the spring to say that Paris Accord was critical, that parties were committed to climate action. In taking it up now, we now know that the next chair and currently in chairing the Arctic Council is the government of Finland, but we're increasingly getting the science of the urgency that we start asking questions about what is the Arctic we need to have to ensure that we can avoid catastrophic, indeed cataclysmic levels of climate change. This has to do with really asking questions about working backwards from the Paris target of ensuring that we don't go above 1.5 global average temperature, 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase over what it was before the Industrial Revolution, is specifically and urgently critical to the question of what kind of Arctic do we need to have for human civilization to survive. It relates very directly to evidence, which is most recently in Nature, a projection for on current levels of governmental commitments, and I mean government commitments globally. There's only a 5% chance that we will stick to 1.5. But for every degree of warming above where we are now, recent studies in Nature Climate Change predict that for every 1 degree C warming, we will see 1.5 million square miles of permafrost disappear. And every ounce of permafrost that disappears releases vast quantities of methane, which is 20 times more powerful unit for unit than carbon dioxide. In other words, if the world's permafrost melts, it's game over for humanity. I mean, it's stark, it's real. So the urgency of acting means that we not take our target from the Paris Accord at the weak target left behind by the Conservatives of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, but actually take on board the far more real challenge, which Canada supported in Paris, of avoiding 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the challenge I put to the government.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend from Saanich Gulf Island for bringing us back to this question, and hope that I'll be able to provide her with some helpful information. As she knows, the Foreign Minister did lead Canada's delegation to the Fairbanks Arctic Council meeting, where the Minister successfully underscored the priority that the Government of Canada is committed to the Arctic, and this was demonstrated by our partnership with Northerners, Indigenous people, and through funding for renewable energy and energy security, including $400 million for the Arctic Energy Fund announced in Budget 2017. This year's Arctic Council ministerial meeting demonstrated all 8 nations' key commitments to the Arctic. We reiterated the need for global action on climate change and also made note in the Fairbanks Declaration of the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. Canada worked closely with all Arctic states and Indigenous peoples organizations at the Fairbanks meeting to ensure that all of our respective positions on the environment reflected this important fact. An agreement was reached among all 8 Arctic states to sign a ministerial declaration that notes the importance of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the need as well for global action to reduce both long-lived greenhouse gases and short-lived climate pollutants, and a reaffirmation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Madam Speaker, this was the first instrument agreed and signed by the current U.S. administration that contained a reference to the Paris Agreement. The Arctic Council ministers also adopted a report on the progress and recommendations for black carbon and methane reductions, and it included a goal to reduce black carbon emissions by 25 to 33% below 2013 levels by 2025. This is the first ever collective international goal on black carbon ever agreed, which will contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Additionally, Canada, along with the other Arctic states, signed an agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation, which will help increase effectiveness and efficiency in the development of scientific knowledge about the region, as well as strengthen scientific cooperation in the Arctic, including at the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut. Le Canada sait bien que le
Canada knows that climate change has a powerful impact, and that only international action will be able to fight climate change.
So far, Canada's international leadership over the past year to address climate change includes the ratification of the Paris Agreement, the amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase down highly polluting HFCs, and the historic agreement under the International Civil Aviation Organization to address greenhouse gas emissions from the aviation sector. Madam Speaker, everyone on this side of the House and the government share the members' concerns and need to ensure that we act to promote environmental sustainability, guard against ecosystem pollution, and ensure that we have an Arctic that can thrive for years to come. That's the view of the government, and it's only by working together that we'll achieve our international commitments as laid out in the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and certainly the black carbon announcement from the Arctic Council was welcome, but I don't think it was the first. It was also, there were the first global commitment to reduce black carbon was, I recall, at the Conference of the Parties that took place in Durban. But setting that aside, we're now looking at clearer evidence all the time that Canada's current domestic plans, our international commitments fall far short of the rhetoric. This was underscored yesterday in the report by the Environmental Commissioner within the Office of the Auditor General, that Canada is completely unprepared to deal with the consequences of climate change and that we're not acting aggressively enough at all to meet our Paris targets. So while I celebrate good intentions on the part of the Liberal government, it's time to see far more aggressive action using tools in the federal jurisdictional toolbox. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Madam Speaker, Canada will continue to play a leadership role as it is now at home and amongst international partners to address climate change and to drive the transition of our global economy towards sustainability and inclusivity. We do continue to lead the way, not only in having ambitious targets, but in ensuring that we have a plan that will help us meet them. Madam Speaker, we are working with all of our Arctic Council partners, states, and Indigenous peoples organizations and observers to ensure joint leadership on climate and environmental issues as addressed, and so that they address the needs of Northerners in Canada and around the circumpolar North. And Madam Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for bringing this issue of importance back to the floor this evening.